The story of the house on the hill. I have been a park ranger at this national park for over 10 years, witnessing all sorts of strange situations, from people getting lost due to their own negligence, dangerous poachers, to even mysterious disappearances that no one could explain. But there was one night that stayed with me, a night that even after many years still sends a chill down my spine when I think back on it. It all started on a fall Friday night. I was sitting in the ranger station sipping a cup of coffee, staring at the surveillance screen, which only showed blurry images of winding trails and trees swaying in the wind. That peace was shattered when the radio beside me crackled to life. 2:14, this is Willow Creek Police. We received a report about 3 missing teenagers in the Blackwood Hill area. They haven't come home since this afternoon. The family says the kids mentioned an abandoned house on the hill. Can you assist? I slammed my coffee cup down on the table, immediately on high alert. Blackwood Hill was not a place anyone wanted to go. It was located at the edge of the national park, an area that had been abandoned for a long time, with an old house and plenty of disturbing stories surrounding it. I had heard many rumors that it was the site of a family massacre, that the owners of the house disappeared without a trace, and that anyone who entered never came out. While I didn't believe in superstitions, I knew that areas like this often attracted drifters, criminals, or worse, those with malicious intent. I met 2 police officers at the base of Blackwood Hill. The trail leading up to the house hadn't been maintained in years. It was just a rough dirt path with tangled roots, as if the forest itself was trying to reclaim it. As we neared the top, a cold wind swept through, carrying with it a heavy, unexplainable feeling. The house slowly came into view, an old, decaying 2-story wooden house, its windows shattered like empty eyes staring down at us. I swallowed hard. Something was wrong. My instincts, honed over years of working in dangerous situations, told me we shouldn't be here alone. But the 3 missing children were out there, and if there was any chance of finding them, we couldn't back down. Officer Carter, the oldest in the group, picked up the radio and spoke briefly. We are approaching the house, no signs outside, proceeding with a search. I stepped onto the wooden stairs, which creaked under my weight. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it gently, and it creaked loudly in the stillness of the air. Inside was pitch dark. A musty smell hit me, but there was something else mixed in. An odd scent, almost like old clothes that had been left too long. I shone my flashlight around the living room. Peeling wallpaper, the ceiling darkened with mold, the floor covered in thick dust. But among the dust, I saw fresh footprints. I knelt down and gently touched the marks. Someone had been here recently. We split up to search. Carter went upstairs to check the second floor, while I and the other officer moved into the kitchen. The old wooden cupboards were still intact, but when I opened one, I found fresh food boxes. I frowned. "Someone is living here," I whispered. The officer nodded. He pointed to a corner of the kitchen where there was a bowl of food, now dried up. Not the sign of a completely abandoned place. Someone had been here and might still be here. Then I spotted something small on the table. A key. It was newer than the other things in the house. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, a sense of unease rising within me. Suddenly, a sharp scream echoed from below. My heart stopped. A child's scream. We rushed into the hallway where Carter had just come down from the second floor. We all looked at each other, then simultaneously headed toward a small wooden door at the end of the hall, the door that led to the basement. One officer yanked the doorknob, but it was locked. Without hesitation, I pulled the key from my hand and slid it into the lock. A click sounded, and the door slowly creaked open, revealing an old wooden staircase leading down into thick darkness. A foul smell hit us immediately, making me almost gag. We shone our flashlights down, taking careful steps down the stairs, guns ready in our hands. And then I saw them. 3 children. They were tied to chairs, their mouths sealed shut with tape. One was trembling, tears streaming down its face, while the other 2 struggled wildly when they saw our lights. We had found the missing children. The 3 children's faces were pale with fear, their eyes wide as they stared at me, tears glistening in the flashlight's beam. I rushed toward them, while the 2 officers behind me carefully scanned the surroundings, guns ready in hand. We didn't know who had done this, but I was certain of one thing. he could still be here. I cut the ropes binding the first child, a 14-year-old boy, his face gaunt and trembling as if he had just lived through a horrifying nightmare. The boy didn't say anything, just shook his head vigorously when I tried to reassure him. I quickly removed the tape from his mouth, but before he could speak, a noise echoed from above the stairs. Someone had just closed a door. We all jumped. One officer immediately rushed to the stairs, but the door had been locked from the outside. I heard hurried footsteps running down the hallway above. He knew we were here. He was trying to trap us. I immediately grabbed the radio, my voice tense. 214 calling the dispatcher. We are trapped in the basement of the house on Blackwood Hill. Request immediate backup. The suspect is still in the house. There was no time to wait. We tried to break the door down. The two officers pushed hard against the old wooden door, but it remained suspiciously sturdy. Clearly, it had been reinforced. I realized that this man was not just some ordinary drifter. He had prepared for this situation. Just a few seconds later, we heard footsteps again from above the stairs, and then a hoarse voice echoed down. "I don't want to hurt anyone." We froze. The voice belonged to an older man. I shone my flashlight up toward the dark stairs, where a shadowy figure slowly appeared. He descended slowly as though unafraid of being discovered. An older man, perhaps in his 60s, with disheveled long hair and a scruffy beard that covered most of his face. His clothes were old and dirty, his eyes sunken deep, but there was something in his gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. Not anger or aggression, but loneliness. He stood a few steps away from us, raising both hands in a non-threatening gesture, his voice soft but haunting. "I don't want to hurt them. I just wanted someone to talk to." I glanced at the three children huddled in the corner, their eyes filled with terror. If he truly only wanted someone to talk to, why were they so frightened? One officer drew his handcuffs and stepped forward. "Kneel down. Put your hands behind your head." The man didn't resist. He just sighed, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "They always run away." Those words sent a chill down my spine. They? Had he done this before? After we managed to get the three children out of the basement and handed them over to the waiting rescue team outside, I returned inside the house, where the man, now handcuffed, sat on a chair, his head bowed, looking like a shadow of his former self. His name was Henry Lawson. He had been a resident of Willow Creek over 30 years ago. He disappeared from society after his wife and children died in an accident, living alone in this house for decades without anyone knowing. But instead of simply being a recluse, he began developing twisted thoughts about keeping people around to have company. The children told us that he lured them into the house by pretending to be injured, then locked the door and wouldn't let them leave. They weren't harmed or hurt, but the way he spoke, laughed to himself, and told stories about other children he had kept in the past terrified them. The question remained how many other children had fallen into this trap, and had they all managed to escape? He was arrested that very night and brought to trial for kidnapping. During the trial, he only said one thing when his defense attorney asked why he did it. "I didn't want to be alone anymore." There was something in his voice that silenced the entire courtroom. Not remorse, not justification, just an endless loneliness. After the case, the house on the hill was sealed off. A year later, it was demolished to prevent curious people from continuing to visit. But for those who had stepped inside that house, especially the three children, the darkness in their memories would never disappear. As for me, I continued my ranger duties, but since that day, every time I patrol near that area, I always wonder how many others like Henry Lawson are hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone to step unknowingly into their world. The hunter story. I work in a vast forest in Wyoming, an area with pristine regions and few inhabitants. The trails through the woods are often very quiet, marked only by signs of wildlife. This area rarely sees outsiders, which is why it has become an ideal spot for poachers. My job is to patrol, protect, and monitor the wildlife in this forest while preventing illegal hunting activities. One early morning, like any other day, I woke up early, prepared my gear, and set out to start my work. Today, I planned to check a remote area near a creek where I had noticed unusual signs during previous patrols. The weather seemed harsh this season, but I didn't let that stop me from completing my mission. After gathering everything, I took along a staff, a bag with necessary tools, and a handgun for protection if needed. As I entered the forest, everything seemed unusually peaceful. Animal tracks were still visible on the ground. However, when I got closer to the creek area, an unexpected sight appeared. Traps set all around. Some were metal snares, cleverly placed on the ground near branches and bushes, making it impossible not to be suspicious. This wasn't the first time I'd found traps like these, but this time it seemed more serious. I decided to follow the trail. What concerned me even more was that these traps weren't just aimed at small animals, they could easily kill larger creatures. I couldn't just sit back and allow these poachers to operate freely. With every step I took, my tension grew. The sound of wind rustling through the branches added to the ominous atmosphere in the forest. I couldn't help but wonder whether I would find the person who set these traps, or if they had noticed me following them. Before long, I heard a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the woods, but the sound grew closer. I carefully moved through the bushes to investigate. Suddenly, I saw a man holding a shotgun, walking toward one of the traps. He seemed unaware of my presence, so I stayed still, trying to observe every move he made. I couldn't let him continue like this. Protecting the animals was my duty, and I couldn't allow this poacher to further harm the forest. I decided to approach and order him to stop. I stepped out from my hiding place and shouted, "Stop! Put the gun down and don't move." The man quickly turned around, his eyes full of surprise, as if he couldn't believe someone was watching him. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to stay calm as I moved closer to him. The man looked at me, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "Nothing for you to worry about, I'm just hunting," he replied, his voice unsure. However, I noticed a hint of anxiety in his eyes, as if he was trying to hide something. "Do you have a hunting license?" I asked, keeping my tone serious. I already knew the answer, but I needed to clarify. The man stayed silent for a moment, seemingly thinking. Then he quickly shook his head as if trying to escape the situation. "I don't need a license. I hunt in places where no one notices," he said, his voice becoming firmer. His eyes turned cold, a clear sign of frustration. I couldn't accept that response. Although I felt a bit nervous, I couldn't allow this poacher to continue his activities. "Do you know that's illegal? I'm a forest ranger, and I have the right to report this to the authorities. You're not allowed to hunt here, especially without a valid license." The man looked at me, his expression tense. "You don't understand. I don't want trouble. You can go somewhere else and leave me alone," he replied, his voice sharp. I stood firm, unwilling to back down. "If you don't want trouble, I suggest you come with me to the ranger station. You're not allowed to hunt here, and I won't ignore this violation." A moment of silence passed before suddenly the man's demeanor shifted. He placed the shotgun on the ground, but then quickly grabbed it again and pointed it directly at me. "Do you want me to stay quiet?" he yelled, his voice full of anger. "If you don't want any trouble, you better leave." I stood motionless. Despite the fear in my heart, I couldn't let this man intimidate me. "You don't have the right to do that," I said, my voice firmer than ever. "If you continue like this, I'll have to call for backup." Seeing that I wasn't backing down, the man became more agitated. He didn't dare move forward, but his gaze remained dangerous. Finally, he sighed, carefully picked up the shotgun, and turned to leave, walking quickly toward the forest. "Next time, I won't let you interfere," he said angrily, but I didn't reply. I just stood there watching. As he disappeared into the darkness of the woods, I stood still, unable to believe I had just escaped a dangerous situation. Although no confrontation occurred, I knew this wouldn't be the last time I'd face poachers like him. The forest would always have hidden dangers, and I had to remain vigilant. The man's gaze never left me, and I could feel the tension building between us. As he held the shotgun firmly in his hands, I realized he had no intention of backing down, despite my warning. I couldn't remain still in this situation. Every decision had to be made in an instant. One small mistake, and I could pay with my life. Inside, fear started to rise, but I knew that fear would only make me weaker. I thought back to the lessons I had learned from previous training courses about how to handle dangerous situations. However, despite being mentally prepared for many tense scenarios, I never imagined facing someone like him, Someone not only breaking the law, but willing to attack anyone who dared to stand in his way. As he snarled and aimed the gun at me, I realized that if I didn't act quickly, I would lose control of the situation. My mind raced through a plan. How could I escape this situation without taking too many risks? I needed a way to keep my distance from him while also notifying my team about the situation. Their help was the only thing that could save me now. I slowly reached for the radio in my side pouch, my palms already drenched in sweat. I couldn't let him notice my movements. As I reached into the pouch, I tried to keep my actions calm, but my heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I quickly turned on the radio and whispered into the microphone, "Ranger Station, this is Ranger number 317. I'm in danger. A poacher with a weapon. I'm located 200 meters east of the Golden Creek. Immediate assistance needed. Repeat, immediate assistance needed." I waited, but there was no response. This made the situation even more tense, but I had no choice but to stay calm. I could feel the man's gaze, heavy and threatening. He still had the gun aimed at me, but he wasn't taking further action. Suddenly, I noticed a change in his behavior. His hands began to tremble slightly, and a thin wisp of smoke escaped his mouth as he exhaled deeply. I quickly realized it wasn't fear. It was a familiar sign I had seen before in other cases. He might be using opium or some other stimulant. His gaze became cloudy, and his voice started to lose its rhythm. "You don't understand. I have to do this to survive," he whispered, his voice slurring due to his delirium. "This forest is mine. You don't have the right to be here." His words seemed irrational, but I understood that he wasn't entirely in his right mind. The sense of danger instantly escalated. If he was indeed under the influence of drugs, his actions could become unpredictable and far more dangerous. His eyes were locked onto me, and I could sense the madness in every small movement he made. I wasn't sure if he was clear-headed enough to realize I had no intention of threatening or attacking him, but it was obvious he had lost his grip on reason. A thought flashed through my mind. I had to keep my distance and, if necessary, find a way to distract him to deceive him. I couldn't afford to be caught or attacked without the ability to defend myself. As his eyes began to glaze over, I realized this was my only chance to act. But in a split second, I felt the tension in the air shift. I suddenly heard a noise from behind, and I immediately recognized it as the sound of an approaching vehicle. My team had arrived. They were just in time, but I couldn't let my guard down. I kept my focus on him, staying alert. "He's not stable," I said quickly, but not loud enough for him to hear. "Keep your distance. He's armed and may get more aggressive." Moments later, I heard the sound of a forest vehicle drawing nearer. Finally, the police arrived, and I saw the small trucks parked just outside the area. 2 officers stepped out, and I quickly waved them over to approach from different angles. As the officers got closer, the man began shouting, but he was too disoriented to attack. The pressure seemed to cause him to lose even more control. At that moment, one officer quickly moved in and disarmed him, while the others restrained him to ensure he wouldn't make any more dangerous moves. After the police arrested and checked him, they discovered that the man was a drug addict who had been poaching in the area for some time. They found more evidence indicating that he had been living a nomadic life, isolated from society, and had continuously engaged in illegal hunting. The traps I had discovered earlier were all his. The police also seized several weapons and hunting tools without licenses. After a thorough investigation, I was informed that the man had a history of similar crimes. When I returned to the ranger station, I was thanked by the authorities. They praised my courage and decisiveness in this dangerous situation. But I couldn't stop thinking about the forest. I knew that although I had succeeded today, this forest, which I loved and protected, was still a place full of dangers. I couldn't predict when new threats would arise, and I knew my job would never be over. The story of the hunter who did not warn. I sighed, wiping the sweat from my forehead as I stepped through the thick layer of dry leaves beneath my boots. 3 hours of patrolling under the blazing midday sun, the worst possible time to be trekking through the forest. I silently cursed myself for not choosing the morning shift or waiting until late afternoon. But today was the scheduled inspection of the no hunting zone in Idaho National Forest, and I had no other choice. The trees grew close together here, their dense canopies allowing only a few rays of sunlight to filter through to the ground. The oppressive heat weighed on me, mixing with the scent of summer forest and the sweat clinging to my shirt. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that all I had to do was complete my inspection, mark it on the map, and head back to the station. No one would be out hunting in this sweltering heat. At least, that's what I thought. Then I saw it. An old truck, parked off a narrow dirt road not far from where I stood. It was covered in mud as if it had recently driven through a swampy trail somewhere deep in the forest. But the mud wasn't what made me freeze in place. It was the bloody handprints on the door. The exhaustion vanished instantly, replaced by a cold surge of adrenaline. I slowed my steps, eyes scanning the area to make sure no one was around. A strange feeling crept over me, the instinctive unease that any seasoned ranger would recognize, the kind of feeling you get when you know something is very wrong. I moved closer, my hand resting on the radio at my hip. The truck's door was slightly ajar. I leaned in to take a look. Blood covered the front seats. There was no one inside. No hunting rifle, no backpack, no gear, just streaks of blood smeared across the dashboard and upholstery. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. This wasn't just an illegal hunting case. I crouched down, looking for tracks on the ground. The mud was disturbed. Footprints led away from the truck and into the forest. I hesitated for a moment. I'd caught poachers sneaking into restricted areas before, but nothing had ever felt this ominous. A part of me wanted to turn back, get to my vehicle, and call for backup. But another part, stronger, more insistent, told me to follow the trail. If someone was hurt, I needed to find them. So I followed the blood-stained footprints. They led me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the sunlight faded into dim streaks between the branches. I moved cautiously, one step at a time, my eyes scanning the undergrowth. Then I heard it. Laughter. A low, dry chuckle echoed from somewhere ahead. My body tensed as I pressed myself against a tree, a heart pounding. Peering through the foliage, I saw them. 3 men, standing around something they were carrying. I held my breath, watching. They were holding a sleeping bag, and it was soaked in blood. My mind froze for a split second. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. This wasn't poaching. This was something else. I inhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay calm. If I handled this the wrong way, things could turn dangerous very quickly. Stepping out from my hiding place, I called out, my voice firm. "Don't move." The 3 men froze. They turned to look at me, and for a brief moment I saw surprise flash in their eyes. But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read. "We're not doing anything wrong," one of them said. I stepped closer, keeping my voice steady. "What's in the sleeping bag?" Another man smirked. "We found it in the woods. Someone must have left it behind." His words felt hollow, completely unconvincing. My gaze flicked down to the sleeping bag. Fresh blood was dripping from one corner. I knew they were lying. "Open it," I ordered. The 3 exchanged glances. One of them pressed his lips together as if debating something. Then he nodded, crouched down, and unzipped the bag. I forced myself to breathe evenly as the zipper rasped open. And then I saw it. A body. A young man, maybe in his 20s, pale and lifeless, his empty eyes staring at nothing. A bullet hole straight through his chest. I instinctively stepped back, my hand flying to my radio. I need immediate backup. But I didn't get to finish. One of the men pulled out a gun. I reacted instantly, drawing my own weapon and aiming it at him. "Don't do it," I warned, my voice sharp. He narrowed his eyes but didn't shoot. The air between us was thick with tension and unspoken standoff. I knew I wouldn't win if they decided to open fire. I only had my pistol. They had the advantage of numbers and preparation. I needed to think fast. The man lowered his gun slightly, but his gaze remained ice cold. "Listen, Ranger," he said, his voice eerily calm. "We don't want trouble. We just found this guy out here." I didn't believe a single word. They had killed him. I didn't know why, whether it was a dispute gone wrong or something far worse, but I knew one thing for certain. If I didn't handle this carefully, I would be the next body lying in this forest. I tightened my grip on my gun, my mind racing. "If you don't want trouble," I said, my tone unyielding, "then drop your weapons and get on the ground, now." They looked at each other. I could see the calculation in their eyes. If they refused, I would have to shoot. I just hoped I was fast enough. I stood still, my gun still aimed straight at the three men, trying to keep my breathing steady. Every muscle in my body was tense, my senses heightened. If even one of them made a stupid move, I would have to pull the trigger. "Listen," I said slowly, my eyes locked onto the man holding the gun. "The police are on their way. You still have a chance to surrender without anyone getting hurt." The man in the middle, the one who seemed to be the leader, smirked. "Really? We just found the body. Who the hell would believe a damn park ranger?" A chill ran down my spine. They were stalling. I couldn't let them drag this out. My hand slipped down to my radio, pressing the button for backup. "This is Ranger Carter. Situation escalating. Requesting immediate assistance. 3 armed suspects." "Copy that. Officers en route. ETA 5 minutes." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. 5 minutes. I just needed to hold out for 5 minutes. But I didn't have 5 minutes. One of the men moved. I saw it from the corner of my eye, but I wasn't fast enough to react before he pulled his gun. The gunshot rang out. I had only a split second to dive behind the nearest tree. The bullet whizzed past my ear, splintering the bark and sending tiny shards flying. Adrenaline flooded my veins as I rolled, regaining my stance, gun ready. "Don't do this," I shouted, taking cover behind the trunk. "Drop your weapons now." A dry chuckle echoed from behind the trees. "You're cornered, Ranger. You really think the cops will get here in time?" I clenched my jaw. They thought I was an easy target. But they forgot one thing. This was the forest, and I knew it better than anyone. Shifting slightly, I aimed my flashlight toward them, using the beam as a distraction. As soon as I saw the light reflect off one of their eyes, I fired. The shot struck the tree next to the man who had fired at me. He cursed and stumbled back. I took advantage of the moment to reposition myself, ducking behind a dense bush. A siren wailed in the distance. They heard it too. One of them swore. "Shit, we gotta go!" I couldn't let them escape. I bolted from cover, gun raised. "Freeze! Drop your weapons now!" One of them, panicked, threw his hands up, but the other two hesitated. The leader tightened his grip on his gun, his eyes darting around for an escape route. The police headlights cut through the trees, and then a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "This is the police! Drop your weapons and get on the ground now!" Relief surged through me as I saw the flashing red and blue lights. 6 officers rushed in, weapons drawn. I immediately stepped back, raising my hands slightly to show I wasn't a threat. "Ranger Carter," I called out. 3 suspects, 1 armed." "Get down," one officer shouted, and they had no choice. The leader hesitated for a second, but then he realized he couldn't win. He dropped his gun, raising his hands. Within seconds, all 3 were forced to the ground and handcuffed. I stood there, breathing heavily, my eyes fixed on the blood-soaked sleeping bag. One of the officers crouched down, unzipping it. I held my breath. Inside was the body of a teenage boy, his face pale, his eyes frozen open in an empty stare. My throat went dry. The officer looked at me, his expression grim. "This kid's been missing for a month." I swallowed hard, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Once the scene was secured, I stood there for a long time, watching as the suspects were hauled away. None of them spoke, except for one, the leader. He turned to look at me, flashing that same twisted smirk. "You got lucky," he muttered. I didn't respond. I just stared at him, gripping my gun tightly, a silent reminder that he couldn't hurt anyone else. As the police cars sped away, I remained standing, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. That night still haunts me. A single second of hesitation, and I could have been dead. Have the story. The midnight escape. A scream shattered the stillness of the night. I jolted up from my chair, heart pounding. The ranger station's window rattled as desperate knocking echoed through the small room. "Help me! Please open the door! Someone is chasing me!" Without hesitation, I grabbed the gun at my hip and rushed toward the door. I yanked the bolt open, and the door swung wide. A young woman stumbled inside, trembling, her breath ragged as if she had run for miles without stopping. Her wide eyes were filled with sheer terror, her face pale with fear. She collapsed onto the floor, clutching my arms as if I were her only lifeline in a raging storm. "He has a knife," she stammered between gasps. He's been following me." I quickly shut the door, locking it tight, then helped her onto a chair. She was still shaking. her hands clenched so tightly they turned white. Kneeling to her eye level, I kept my voice steady. "Take a deep breath. You're safe now. Tell me what happened." She took a shaky inhale, then began speaking, her voice still trembling with fear. "My boyfriend and we went camping south of here near the lake. Everything was fine until nightfall. He left to gather firewood and I stayed alone in the tent." She swallowed hard, staring at her trembling hands. "At first, I just felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw him. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end." "Him?" I asked. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "A man. He was standing in the woods, not far away, just staring. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was tall, thin, wearing a thick coat and a hat." She shuddered at the memory. "At first, I thought he might just be a hunter, but then he started moving toward me, and when I looked closer, I saw he was holding a knife." A choked sob escaped her. I called out, asking what he wanted. He didn't answer. He just kept walking, slowly, like he knew I'd panic and run. I grabbed my flashlight, shined it at him, but he didn't stop. My heartbeat matched the rhythm of her words. "And you ran?" I guessed. She nodded. "I didn't even think. I just bolted out of the tent, straight into the woods. I didn't dare look back. I didn't know if he was chasing me. I just ran and ran until I saw the light from this station." I took a deep breath, fully grasping the severity of the situation. What about her boyfriend? Was he still back there? Had that man done something to him? I stood up, reaching for the radio, but the signal was too weak to call for help. Clenching my flashlight, I turned back to the girl. "What's your name?" I asked. "Sophie," she whispered. "Sophie, I need to go back. Your boyfriend might still be in danger." She stared at me, eyes full of dread. "You can't go alone. He could still be out there." I knew that, but I also knew that if I didn't go, someone else might never be found. I checked my gun, slipped the radio into my pocket, then looked at her. "Stay here. Lock the door. If anything happens, use this radio to call for help." She wanted to argue, but she knew she couldn't stop me. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped into the night. The air outside was cold and heavy, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Moving quickly along the trail, I swung my flashlight over the blackened treetops. The silence was unnerving, swallowing every sound except my own footsteps crunching over dead leaves. As I neared the campsite Sophie had described, I slowed down, every sense sharpened, listening for anything out of place. And then I saw it. Their tent was still there, but it had been shredded. My heart pounded as I cautiously approached, gun at the ready. My flashlight revealed a chaotic mess inside the torn fabric, backpacks overturned, a shattered flashlight lying on the ground. No sign of her boyfriend. A cold sweat trickled down my spine. This wasn't just a random attack. Whoever did this had planned it. A faint breeze carried an unfamiliar scent. I frowned, inhaling deeply. Blood. I swept my flashlight across the area, scanning for any clues. Then I saw it. A thin trail of blood leading from the tent into the depths of the forest. I stood still, my breath slow and steady. Someone was hurt, and if I didn't move fast, it might already be too late. I stood there, staring at the trail of blood leading into the forest, a deep sense of unease tightening in my chest. A part of me wanted to rush in immediately, but logic held me back. I needed backup. Gripping my radio tightly, I spoke into the stillness of the night, my voice urgent. "This is Ranger Carter. I need immediate assistance. Signs of an attack at the campsite near the southern lake. Possible abduction or injury. Requesting police units now." The radio crackled before a dispatcher's voice came through clearly. "Copy that, Carter. Officers are en route. ETA, 20 minutes. 20 minutes. A few minutes in a situation like this could mean the difference between life and death. I couldn't just stand there and wait. I turned back toward the ranger station, where Sophie was still curled up in the chair, her tense eyes locked onto me as I entered. "I've called the police," I said quickly, "but we're going back now." She hesitated, then nodded. I handed her a jacket and a folding knife. It wasn't much, but having something in her hands might help her feel less helpless. "Stay close to me. Do not leave my side for even a second." We left the station, moving quickly toward the campsite. This time, I didn't feel the cold night air at all. My body was running on pure adrenaline, every nerve alert, every muscle tight with tension. When we reached the tent, the scene was exactly as I had left it. torn apart, scattered belongings everywhere. Sophie let out a sharp breath, her fingers digging into my arm. "Where's Jake?" Her voice broke. I had no answer. I swept my flashlight around, searching for more clues. The small bloodstains on the ground had started to dry, indicating that whatever had happened, it had been at least a few hours ago. I crouched down, examining the earth beneath the dim glow of my light. That's when I noticed it. A drag mark. Someone had been pulled away. A chill ran down my spine. "Sophie, Jake might have been taken. We need to follow this trail, but we have to be careful." She nodded, though fear was evident in her eyes. We followed the marks, slowly making our way through the dense forest step by step. The crunch of dry leaves beneath our feet only heightened the tension. Every rustling branch in the wind made my pulse spike, my eyes scanning every shadow. Then, after nearly 20 minutes of walking, we saw it, a run-down wooden cabin hidden deep among the trees. It looked abandoned, its wooden roof caved in at places, windows covered in dust. But one detail immediately put me on high alert. The front door was slightly ajar. I signaled for Sophie to stay put, then moved forward cautiously, gun at the ready. Taking a deep breath, I steadied my grip and slowly pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside was a mess. Old mattresses scattered across the floor, discarded foods strewn everywhere. But what sent a shiver down my spine was the overpowering stench, blood, sweat, and the sickening odor of someone being held in confinement for too long. Then I heard it. A faint noise from beneath the floorboards, a weak, muffled groan, desperate, barely audible. I shone my flashlight downward. There was a trapdoor. My heart pounded as I hurried over, gripping the handle and pulling hard. The wooden door swung open, revealing a staircase leading into darkness. My flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a figure bound tightly on the floor. Jake. Sophie gasped, then cried out, "Jake!" I rushed down the stairs, quickly cutting the ropes around his wrists and ankles. His mouth had been sealed with duct tape. I tore it off in one swift motion. He gasped for breath, his wide, frantic eyes locking onto mine. "He's still here," Jake whispered, his grip tightening on my arm. Then, a noise from above. Footsteps. I immediately raised my gun, pushing Sophie and Jake behind me. A shadow loomed at the top of the staircase, caught in the beam of my flashlight. A tall, thin man with greasy, unkempt hair. His hollow eyes stared blankly at us, a twisted smile curling on his lips. "So, you finally made it," he rasped, his voice dripping with mockery. I didn't give him the chance to do anything else. "Down on your knees! Hands behind your head!" I barked, finger tightening on the trigger. He just chuckled. "You don't want to have a little more fun first?" He didn't move, but I wasn't about to wait. I charged up the stairs, slamming him against the wall, gun pressed against his temple. I kept him pinned there until the distant sound of police sirens cut through the silence. He didn't resist. When the officers stormed in moments later, he simply raised his hands, that eerie smirk still plastered on his face. After it was all over, I sat on the steps of the cabin, my breath still uneven. Sophie clung to Jake, tears streaking her face as she held him tightly. A police officer approached me, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "He's a fugitive," the officer said, "wanted for multiple abductions. You saved 2 lives tonight." I didn't say anything. I just stared into the forest, where the darkness still stretched endlessly, untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. If Sophie had been just a few minutes later, this night could have ended very differently. The silent man's story. "Are you sure he stood there all night?" I frowned, looking at the trembling man before me. "Yes, we didn't dare go outside. At first, we thought he was just another camper. But he just stood there, right at the edge of the firelight, watching us, not moving, not saying a single word." The man, Mark, panted, his eyes still filled with horror. Beside him, his wife, Lisa, clung tightly to his arm, her fingers pressing so hard that her knuckles turned white. I tried calling out to him, asking if he was okay, but he just stared. When dawn broke, we got up to pack our tent, and he was gone. Lisa stammered, her voice dry as if the warmth had been drained from her throat. I crossed my arms, feeling the early morning chill seep through my ranger's jacket. I had encountered many strange folks in the forest. Lost hikers, drifters, or sometimes just eccentric loners who preferred solitude. But someone standing motionless outside a tent all night without doing anything, that was unusual. "I'll check it out," I said, keeping my tone reassuring. You two stay calm, don't worry too much. Mark swallowed hard and nodded, but I could see that fear still lingered in his eyes. When I arrived at the campsite, the air was still damp with morning mist. This area was remote, rarely visited, but signs of recent campers were clear. Ashes from old campfires, empty beer bottles, and boot prints pressed into the damp earth. I moved slowly, scanning between the trees, and then I saw him. A tall, gaunt man stood between two tree trunks, wearing a tattered coat. His face was sunken, and his long, matted hair looked as if it hadn't been cared for in years. But what sent a shiver down my spine were his eyes, empty and lifeless, like a long-abandoned doll. I cleared my throat and took a step toward him. "Hey, are you all right?" I kept my voice steady. No response. "Are you a camper or are you lost?" Still nothing. I cautiously stepped forward, my hand grazing the radio at my hip. My instincts screamed that something was very wrong. "You need to leave this area," I said, my tone firmer now. "This is not a place for long-term stays." The man curled his lips into a bizarre smile, not quite threatening, but certainly not friendly. He turned away and slowly walked into the woods, his movements sluggish, as if nothing in the world mattered. I watched until he disappeared into the trees. What the hell just happened? That night, I decided to stay at the campsite to ensure the safety of other visitors. I set up a simple tent, lit a small fire, and kept my radio within reach. The local police had been notified of the stranger's presence, but they only told me to keep an eye on the situation. At around 2 a.m., a soft sound woke me, a footstep. I didn't turn on my flashlight right away. Instead, I listened carefully. The footsteps were slow, almost deliberately quiet. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it outside. The man stood right outside my tent. My heart pounded. My body tensed, a mix of fear and professional reflex. I didn't scream or panic, but every nerve in my body screamed danger. He was less than 10 feet away. His face remained expressionless, his dark eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. "I warned you," I said, my voice low but firm. "You need to leave now." He didn't move. I reached toward my holstered gun. I didn't want to use it, but if he took another step, I wouldn't have a choice. And then he did something that made my blood run cold. He raised a hand, not to attack, but to press a single finger to his lips. "Shh!" I felt my entire body go rigid. What the hell? In an instant, he turned and walked into the forest, vanishing like a ghost. I stood there, breathing hard, my pulse hammering against my ribs. He wasn't just some wanderer. He knew something. Was he warning me? Or threatening me? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the only one watching that night. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my other hand brushing lightly over the grip of my gun. The night air was freezing, but I felt a slow heat creeping up my spine, a primal alertness I had learned over years as a ranger. "I warned you," I repeated, this time with no patience left in my voice. "Leave now, or I'll call the police." The man remained still. He wasn't angry, nor was he afraid. He just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. "Can you hear me?" I shouted louder, hoping to wake anyone in the nearby campsite. If anything happened, at least there would be witnesses. No response. A deep unease bloomed in my chest. I had no other choice. I drew my gun. "This is your final warning." I stepped forward, aiming directly at him. "Turn around and leave immediately." The flashlight beam illuminated his face, and for the first time I saw the stranger clearly. His eyes were unfocused, as if he wasn't really looking at me, but through me. His lips curled into an awkward, unnatural smile. Not happy, not hostile, just wrong. I had seen that kind of smile before. On wanted posters, sweat slicked my palms, but I kept my gun steady. "I'm calling the police." Slowly, I backed toward my tent, gripping my radio tightly. My fingers brushed over the transmit button, and I pressed down. "This is Ranger Carter," I said, forcing my voice to remain calm and firm. "I need immediate backup at campsite 14. There is a suspicious individual refusing to leave. Possible threat." The radio crackled before the dispatcher's voice came through. "Copy that, Carter. A unit is en route. Maintain distance and do not engage." I swallowed hard. Maintain distance? How could I, when he was barely 10 feet away? "Listen," I turned back to the man, keeping my tone steady. "Police are coming. If you don't want trouble, leave now." And then, for the first time, he moved. Not fast, not sudden, just a slight tilt of his head like a dog trying to understand a command. My heart pounded. I couldn't let him just stand there. I took a step forward, my gun unwavering. "Hands behind your head!" I ordered. He didn't comply. Instead, he took a slow step toward me. I immediately stepped back, but my heel caught on an exposed tree root. I stumbled slightly, and in that split second, he closed the distance by another step, less than 6 feet between us. I gritted my teeth, finger tightening on the trigger. If he moved any closer, I'd have to fire. But then, flashing red and blue lights cut through the trees. The police had arrived. Relief flooded me, but I didn't lower my weapon. 3 officers rushed in from the far side of the camp, weapons drawn. One of them shouted, "Freeze! Hands behind your head!" At last, the man reacted. He turned toward the officers, staring at them blankly, then slowly raised his hands. No resistance. No attempt to run. He just smiled. "His name is David Henshaw," one officer told me after they cuffed him and searched his pockets. "Does that name mean anything to you?" I shook my head, my pulse still hammering. The officer exchanged a look with his partner before turning back to me, his expression grim. "He's a fugitive," he said. "Wanted for murdering 3 campers over the past 2 years." A cold knot formed in my stomach. 3? I echoed, my throat dry. "Yes," he nodded. "We found the bodies, 2 men, 1 woman, in remote campsites like this, tortured before being killed." I swallowed hard, feeling ice seep into my bones. Another officer searched Henshaw's coat. A few moments later, he pulled out a large knife. Its blade gleamed under the flashlight beam, but a dark, dried stain coated the edge. Blood. I couldn't breathe. "We'll need forensics to confirm," the officer said, "but I'd bet this is from one of his victims." David Henshaw remained silent, cuffed, restrained. That eerie smile still clung to his lips. A chill crawled up my spine as I realized something. If I hadn't called the police in time, if I hadn't held my ground with my gun, I might have been his next victim. They loaded him into the patrol car, and I stood there, watching the taillights fade into the darkness, still struggling to process what had just happened. The wind stirred through the trees, making me shiver. But this time I wasn't sure if it was from the cold. I turned back to my tent, packing up my gear. I couldn't sleep here tonight. No way. The forest loomed around me, shadows stretching deep into the unknown. Then a memory surfaced, of him raising a single finger to his lips. Shh! Was he threatening me, or warning me? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. The woman! I've been a forest ranger for over 10 years, covering thousands of miles of rugged wilderness, seeing all sorts of strange things. But there's one night in 2018 that I'll never forget. A night when I sensed something was wrong, and it all started with a broken-down car on the side of the road. That night, I was working the night shift. January in Montana is freezing, and the road through the national forest was almost deserted at that hour. I enjoyed the solitude as I drove slowly along the winding road, occasionally stopping to check animal tracks or ensure no one was in trouble. Around 11 p.m., as I rounded a bend, I saw a silver sedan pulled over to the side with its hazard lights flashing. It seemed to have broken down. I slowed my vehicle, pulled up a few meters away, and stopped. I stepped out, shining my flashlight on the thin snow covering the road. Inside the car, a woman was sitting in the driver's seat, her head lowered as if she were fixing something on her phone. As I approached, she looked up, and for a brief moment, I saw fear in her eyes. I raised my hand in a non-threatening way, signaling I meant no harm. "Hello, are you okay? I'm a ranger. Looks like your car broke down." She hesitated, then rolled down the window. I could see her more clearly now. She was in her mid-30s, with brown hair, wearing a dark blue puffer jacket. Her face was pale, whether from the cold or something else, I couldn't tell. "Yes, my car stalled. I think the battery's dead, but my phone has no signal to call for help." Her voice trembled, but it was hard to tell if it was from the cold or nervousness. I flashed my light toward the hood of her car. There were no signs of damage. "Do you want me to try jump-starting it for you?" "No, no need." Her response was too quick. She bit her lip as if realizing how odd it sounded. "I mean, if you could give me a ride to the nearest town, I could call someone to fix it. I don't want to bother you too much." A strange feeling crept over me. She seemed too tense for a simple car breakdown. If she was stranded on a cold night, she should have been relieved someone stopped to help. But instead, she seemed scared I'd stopped at all. I nodded. That's fine. I can take you to the ranger station or the nearest town. But can I quickly check your car just to make sure everything's okay? As soon as I stepped toward her car's front, she opened the door and stepped out. No need, I just want to leave here as soon as possible. She spoke quickly, her voice urgent. I stopped and studied her. Her eyes darted toward the road behind me like she was looking for something, or scared of something. Where were you headed? The question was simple, but she froze. I was on my way to a friend's house. Where does your friend live? Not too far from here. She was lying. I knew it immediately. When someone can't give a clear answer to simple questions, something's off. I glanced into the back seat of her car. No luggage, no bags, nothing that suggested she was traveling anywhere. While I was thinking, she wrapped her jacket tightly around her and glanced behind me again. Please, can we just leave? This time, her voice had a note of desperation. My instincts told me something was happening beyond what I could see, but I didn't want to scare her further. All right, get in. I'll take you to town. She quickly climbed into my ranger vehicle, as if eager to leave this place behind. I turned to walk toward my truck, but just as I reached for the door handle, I heard something from the forest behind us. A faint sound, like someone stepping on snow. I stopped and turned toward the trees. Darkness swallowed everything except the small area illuminated by my truck's headlights. I swept my flashlight across the woods, but saw nothing. When I turned back to the truck, I noticed the woman was shaking. Are you okay? She looked at me, eyes filled with fear. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then shook her head. I started the truck, ready to leave. But just as I pressed the gas, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. Another car, parked about 100 meters away, its headlights off. How long had it been there? My heart slowed for a moment. I turned to the woman. Do you know if someone is following you? She bit her lip, then whispered, You shouldn't have stopped. Her words hit me like a cold shock. My instincts screamed at me to act. I glanced back at the other car, but it remained still. No one got out. I didn't wait any longer. Hold on. I pressed the gas, driving away before anything could unfold, but I could feel it. From the car behind us, someone was watching us. The air inside the car grew unbearably heavy. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but one thing was certain. Someone was watching us. The unmarked car in the darkness remained motionless. I felt the tension tightening around me as I drove toward town, keeping a steady but not overly fast pace to avoid drawing attention. The woman in the passenger seat clutched her coat tightly, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. I reached for the radio and called the ranger station. This is Unit 214. I just found a stranded woman on Route 7 near Pine Hollow Forest. Her car broke down, but there's a suspicious vehicle following us, requesting backup. She suddenly turned to me, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with panic. You shouldn't have stopped. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. At that moment, I saw a figure burst out from the bushes nearby, running straight toward her abandoned car. He appeared so suddenly that I almost didn't believe my eyes. A tall man wearing a black jacket and a baseball cap emerged from the darkness. He didn't hesitate. I pulled out my gun, rolled down the window, and shouted, Stop, park ranger! Stop right there! But instead of stopping, he suddenly changed direction, toward me. In that instant, every instinct in my body screamed at me. This was not a random accident. I was being hunted. But the most shocking thing was, the woman beside me threw open the car door and ran, straight toward the man. They met in the middle of the road and then took off together into the forest. Shit! I cursed, grabbing my flashlight and jumping out of the car. I could chase them. I could fire a warning shot. But something told me this wasn't a situation I could handle alone. Instead, I rushed back to my vehicle and grabbed the radio. This is 214. I was just ambushed. A man and a woman fled into Pine Hollow Forest, heading north. Request immediate backup. It took less than 10 minutes for local police to arrive. I met them at the nearest gas station, explaining everything as another team spread out to search the woods. You're saying they ran together? The woman wasn't a victim? Lieutenant Carter, the lead officer on the case, looked at me sharply. I shook my head. No. She set it up. She wanted me to stop so that guy could ambush me. I'm sure of it. Carter swore under his breath, pulling out his phone and calling the station. A few moments later, One of the officers returned, his face tense. "We have an ID on the man." He held up his phone, displaying a criminal record photo. It was him. The man I had seen rush out of the forest. His name was Wayne Collins, a wanted kidnapper and murderer charged with robbery and assault across 3 different states. He had escaped from prison 2 years ago and had been missing ever since. Carter narrowed his eyes, turning back to me. "And the woman? I don't know." But then a thought struck me. I remembered how she had avoided my questions. I remembered how she kept glancing behind us, afraid of something or someone. She wasn't a victim. She was an accomplice. 3 days later, her abandoned car was found in an empty lot about 15 miles north of the scene. Inside, authorities discovered stolen belongings from 3 different travelers, a handgun with the serial number filed off, and a large sum of cash. Carter called me the moment they found the evidence. "You were right. We're not dealing with just one killer. We're dealing with a pair." They started tracking Collins' last known movements. Within 2 weeks, federal agents located and arrested the woman in a small town in Wyoming. Her name was Jessica Monroe. She was Collins' partner, helping him lure unsuspecting strangers into traps. And sometimes they did more than just rob. Collins was still on the run, but Jessica confessed everything. She explained how they operated, how they picked their targets, usually lone men or anyone kind-hearted enough to stop and help. She had staged a breakdown to make me stop. And if I had stepped too far from my truck, that night might have ended very differently. A few months later, Collins was caught in Texas. He was sentenced to life in prison. Jessica was also convicted as his accomplice. I still work as a ranger, but after that night, I changed. I no longer trust roadside stories so easily. I still help people, but I always keep a safe distance, because now I know sometimes the victim isn't really a victim. Sometimes they're the predator waiting for you to take the bait. I've been a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park for over 10 years. My job mainly revolves around patrolling the forest, ensuring the safety of visitors and wildlife, and occasionally handling cases of lost hikers. But nothing had prepared me for what I was about to encounter on a cold winter morning. That day, I received a report about a man wandering in the forest. No tent, no sleeping bag, just wearing thin clothing in the bone-chilling cold of winter. Cases like this weren't uncommon, sometimes careless tourists, sometimes homeless individuals seeking shelter. But something in the caller's voice made me uneasy. I drove to the reported area, following a rarely traveled trail in winter. When I arrived, I turned off the engine and quietly observed my surroundings. The ground was covered in snow. The trees stood silent, as if holding their breath. I stepped out, the sound of snow crunching under my boots echoing through the still air. I walked a short distance and then I saw him. A thin man, disheveled hair, a pale face from the cold. His eyes were sunken, glowing with a strange light I couldn't quite describe. He wore a thin coat, ripped jeans, and shoes caked with mud and snow. No backpack, no signs of an actual camping trip. I knew immediately that something was off. I slowly approached, maintaining a safe distance. "Hey there, are you okay?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He stared at me for a long moment before answering, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. "I'm lost. I'm just trying to find my way back." I looked around. There were no traces of a campsite, no signs that he had been here for long. "You don't have a tent? No sleeping bag?" He shook his head. "I was just taking a walk and got lost." I knew he was lying. No one just takes a walk in the freezing wilderness without any gear. I offered to take him back to the ranger station, but as soon as I spoke, he took a step back, his eyes wild. "No need," he said quickly. "I can find my own way." Before I could react, he turned and bolted into the forest. I tried to chase after him, but within a few strides, he had vanished among the dense trees. With nothing else I could do, I returned and reported the incident. An uneasy feeling stayed with me the entire evening. The next morning, I returned with a colleague determined to investigate further. We ventured deeper into the forest, back to where I had seen him the previous day. After some searching, we found a makeshift campsite. A tattered blanket lay half buried in the snow. Around it, a few broken branches, signs of an old fire pit. But what sent chills down my spine was a scattering of small bones nearby. I crouched down, picking up one of the bones. It was small, bleached white, stripped of almost all flesh. A sickening feeling crept over me. I didn't need to be a forensic expert to know these were human bones. My colleague grabbed his radio, calling it in. I continued searching the area and found an old wallet buried in the snow. I picked it up and opened it. Inside was an ID card, the photo faded, but the name still legible. When I read that name, my heart nearly stopped. This man had been reported missing 3 years ago, a camper who had gone on a trip in the park and was never seen again. Authorities had searched for months, but found nothing. And now his wallet was here, in the middle of this desolate forest. We immediately alerted the police. When they arrived, they combed through the entire area, uncovering more horrifying evidence: old clothes, larger bone fragments, even personal belongings of other missing persons from recent years. And then they found him. He had been hiding in a small cave not far from the campsite. When the officers dragged him out, I saw that face again, those same wild eyes, that same eerie, unreadable expression. But this time, he didn't run. He just smiled. A smile that sent ice through my veins. When questioned, he said nothing. No explanations, no excuses. But the evidence spoke for itself. He wasn't lost. He had been living in the forest for 3 years, surviving by hunting. His story sent shockwaves through the park. The news spread quickly, and fear gripped everyone. I will never forget the look in his eyes that day. The eyes of someone who had abandoned humanity, leaving only raw, primal survival instincts. After that incident, I never looked at the forest the same way again. The deep, endless woods of Yellowstone, once my home, now seemed to hold far more secrets than I had ever imagined. And every time I patrol, I remember the man who survived in the wilderness, the man who, had he not been discovered, would have continued hunting his prey.